Okay, Seth, so let's start with give us a sense of the relative positions between the former Congressperson Stephen Horsford, I should say, and one of his competitors, Amy Vilela. Let's start with Vilela. She had a specific pitch when it came to healthcare. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so Vilela actually experienced personal tragedy with the healthcare system. A few years back, her daughter was actually having a very sharp, sort of throbbing pain in her leg. She went to the hospital. Basically, what they allege, and they're suing the hospital, the family continues to sue the hospital, was that basically the emergency room there told her, hey, it won't cost you anything if you just leave because you don't have insurance right now. They made a number of attempts to sort of get a diagnosis, but they left. And unfortunately, she ended up dying a few weeks later due to an emergency condition that wasn't diagnosed at that time. So, Amy was not somebody who was necessarily intensely interested in politics or had run for anything before, but that process basically moved her to become a healthcare activist. She was very active against Republican efforts to kind of pare down the Affordable Care Act. She was very active against the former Democratic congressman who resigned following a sexual harassment allegation, basically demanding that he co-sponsor the Medicare for All bill. And finally, she decided to run for Congress, basically to add another sponsor to that bill from the district. Meanwhile, on the other hand, Stephen Horsford has generally been on sort of the more moderate side or more conservative side on healthcare. He was running on a platform basically of working on drug prices through things like a drug pricing commission, helping generic get to market faster. He was a little bit skeptical of single-payer healthcare. He was saying things like, well, it might threaten care from the Veterans Administration, so I'll have to take a hard look at that kind of thing. So I think in terms of their positions, Forster was a little bit more agnostic about healthcare, whereas I think Vilela, in sort of her personal experiences with the healthcare system, she just came to think, hey, if someone goes to the hospital, they should just get care. It shouldn't be about whether they have insurance or not. It shouldn't be about digging through their plan and trying to get the care. So I think in that sense, that primary was very much about Amy running that issue very hard. That's very hard on the left right now. Whereas Horsford, I think, took a little bit more of a non-committal position on healthcare.
Now, I don't really know if I follow the logic behind Medicare for All would in some way inhibit the Veterans Administration healthcare system. We have Medicare for some right now, and the VA still provides a very unique service to vets. Mm-hmm. But putting that aside, right? I mean, we know the broad strokes here of their various positions. So, what in the course of we should say this was, the idea here is, and I think in your piece is to assess the weight in which Democratic primary voters place on the various healthcare positions. There were four other contenders, I guess, between aside from Vilela and Horsford in this Nevada 4th district primary. Where were they on healthcare? I mean, before we start trying to get some lessons from this, I really want to set the context up and sort of get a sense of what we're looking at on the ground.
Well, it's interesting. I think that, they'd have candidate forums and things like that. And when pressed, I think a lot of them said, yeah, we would be open to single payer, we'd be open to Medicare for all. But they didn't necessarily campaign on it. I think it was largely Vilela's issue to campaign on. And I also think, and I've covered a number of primaries, congressional primaries this year, there's definitely a split between candidates who are branding themselves as Medicare for all people and folks who saying, well, that's one way to tackle the healthcare crisis. We should also look at public option. We should look at drug prices, so on and so forth. And so in this race, I think that even Horsford, when I pressed him a little bit over over email, he was saying that he'd be willing to take a look at it, but he still had concerns about the VA and stuff. I think Amy's candidacy was really the only one saying, "Hey, I'm going to come in. I'm going to sponsor 676, which is the bill that's explicitly for single payer that was written by former Congressman John Conyers."
So, what are having a strong position on this, a non-committal position on this specific issue of single payer health care and single payer health care and Medicare for all aren't necessarily the same thing. But I think, at least in the context of your average Democratic primary voter's mind, they position a candidate similarly. Let's put. What does that indicate? I mean, what else can we garner from their positions if those are the two positions they hold? And or even maybe more importantly, what do you think voters in these primaries are reading into these positions?
Well, I think it speaks to a sort of larger issue in that I think when those of us who do political media, we cover political media, we like to cover ideology, we like to cover policy and substance, and that's good because that's, those are probably the most important things for people going to government. But a lot of how elections happen is based on social networks, based on personalities. And there were a lot of other factors in this particular race in Nevada. For instance, probably the single most influential group in this district, which is the Las Vegas area, is the Culinary Workers Union, which is very heavily influenced by former Senate Democratic leader Harry Reid. Reid was in Horsford corner. He had basically signaled to the union to be in his favor, and I believe they had spent something like over $300,000 on the air or something like that. And I don't think Amy ended up spending anything on the airwaves at all. So I think a lot of what happens in elections, for better or worse, is about tapping into existing social networks that are politically influential. And I think a lot of the really politically influential networks were for Horsford. And I think we have to be careful about overreading or overreacting to what simply having a list of policy positions or even a strong, compelling campaign message can do for you in the face of those institutional factors. And I think that also kind of speaks to sort of the Democratic primary voters in general. I think on the Republican side, we've seen a lot more upsets of incumbents. We've seen a lot more ideologically driven campaigns than I think we have on the Democratic side. And part of that, I think, is that the Democratic voters tend to have a little bit more of a bureaucratic mindset. They tend to fall in behind leadership and organizations a little bit more, whereas the Republicans have tended to have a little bit more of a rebellious mindset. And also they tend to have more sort of well-funded organizations and donors who want to take out incumbents and who want to kind of support insurgent-type candidates. So I think all those factors play a role as well. And I think that's why, when you look at an election like this, you shouldn't necessarily see it as a referendum. Okay, these people didn't like Medicare for all. It's probably just that as an issue, it alone was not able to break through very sort of well-set institutional factors in that Las Vegas area district, where I think the Harry Reid machine is very influential, and the Culinary Union and related unions are very influential as well.
That's fascinating. All right. Well, look, I want to take a break, but when we come back, I want to press you on that perception of Democrats and get a sense of how, because I think there's two different things that are operating in that assessment of Democrats. I want to that they A, fall in line, but B, don't have the outside funding that we see on the Republican side. I want to dig into that a bit, and also I want to get your sense of just how widespread the notion is that all you need is a good set of policy ideas for an upstart campaign, as opposed to a whole host of other things that will make you a contending candidate. And lastly, I want to talk about to what extent is a race like this one in Nevada being used as a cudgel against those who think that and are promoting the idea that Medicare for all will have a lot of resonance in general elections against Republicans. We got to take a break. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio. I'm talking to Zaid Jilani. We'll be right back after this.